Trust is the most fragile and powerful currency of human life. It is invisible, intangible, yet everything around us depends on it. From the moment we are born, we are conditioned to trust. A child instinctively trusts the arms that hold them, the voice that soothes them, the promises whispered by the people they cannot yet understand. This trust extends outward as we grow, into schools, governments, institutions, friendships, and love. Civilization itself is built upon an unspoken agreement that we can place our faith in others, and in return, they will not betray it. And yet, history tells a far darker story. For every empire built on trust, there are ruins marked by betrayal. For every leader embraced as a savior, there is a trail of manipulation uncovered years too late. Trust is the very fabric that binds us together, but it is also the lever by which the powerful control the powerless. The more we believe in it, the easier it becomes to exploit us. We are taught to believe that trust is inherently good, that a life without it is a life poisoned by paranoia. But beneath the surface of this ideal lies a haunting truth. Trust often blinds us to the realities of human nature. Carl Jung once wrote of the shadow, the dark side of the psyche that lurks beneath the masks we wear. It is within this shadow that the real motives of people are hidden, motives they may not even fully recognize themselves. We think we are trusting the person in front of us, but often we are trusting only their mask. Consider the child who learns for the first time that a parent is not perfect, that the very figure they believed was invincible is also capable of cruelty, weakness, or deceit. Or the citizen who realizes that the government they served with loyalty has been using their obedience as fuel for corruption. Or the lover who discovers that behind the promise of eternal devotion lies self-interest, desire, or betrayal. These are the fractures where the ideal of trust collides with the shadow of human reality. To live in constant suspicion would be unbearable. But to live in blind faith is just as dangerous. Somewhere between naive trust and destructive paranoia lies a third path, the path of awareness. It is here that the human being begins to transform, not by rejecting trust entirely, but by seeing it for what it is: a gamble, a risk, a wager made in the dark. And this raises the haunting question: what happens when a person stops trusting, not out of bitterness or paranoia, but out of clarity? What happens when they no longer hand over their power to masks, illusions, or promises? When the veil of trust is lifted, the individual no longer plays by the same rules as everyone else. They are no longer easily deceived, no longer bound by the games of manipulation. In the eyes of society, such a person becomes something unsettling, even dangerous. Carl Jung believed that the greatest danger to humanity was not some external enemy, but the unconscious drives hidden within each individual. At the heart of his psychology lies the idea of the shadow, the collection of thoughts, impulses, and desires that we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. These are not always monstrous or evil, but they are often unacceptable to our carefully constructed image of who we think we are. And so, we repress them, bury them, and cover them with masks that the world will accept. This mask, which Jung called the persona, is the polished version of ourselves that we show to others. It is the smile that hides resentment, the charm that conceals ambition, the humility that cloaks pride. Society encourages these masks, even rewards them, because civilization thrives on appearances of order. Yet beneath the persona, the shadow continues to stir, shaping our choices and bending our motives in ways we are often unwilling to admit. When trust enters this equation, the stakes grow even higher. To trust someone is to accept their mask at face value. It is to believe their words, their gestures, their promises, without seeing the hidden machinery of the unconscious that drives them. But as Jung observed, most people are not fully conscious of their own motives. They may believe they are acting out of love, when in truth they are pursuing control. They may speak of justice, when they secretly crave power. They may proclaim selflessness, when in reality they are feeding the hunger of their own ego. History offers endless illustrations of this psychological truth. Leaders rise on the wings of noble promises, presenting themselves as servants of the people, yet behind the curtain their real aim is domination. Consider how often revolutions, born in the language of freedom, descend into tyranny once power changes hands. The masks shift, but the shadow remains. It is not always malicious intent that deceives us, but the blindness of people to their own inner drives. The same pattern appears in the realm of love. A lover swears eternal devotion, convinced of their sincerity, but beneath the surface there are unacknowledged desires, jealousy, insecurity, the need to possess. These motives, unexamined, eventually surface as betrayal, conflict, or disillusionment. The one who trusted believed in the mask, but the shadow was always waiting for its turn to emerge. Even entire societies function this way. Nations present themselves as guardians of order and civilization, yet history reveals how often this image hides systems of exploitation and violence. A society can convince itself of its moral superiority while simultaneously suppressing chaos within its borders. The result is that the appearance of order rests upon layers of denial, repression, and shadow. Jung warned that what is repressed does not disappear. It returns, often with even greater force. A person who denies their envy may become consumed by it. A leader who represses their hunger for power may project it onto enemies, convincing their followers of conspiracies that justify aggression. A nation that denies its inner chaos may externalize it in war. Projection was another key insight Jung offered. What we cannot face in ourselves, we cast onto others. The trait we condemn in another often reflects something buried within our own shadow. This mechanism is not only psychological but political and social. Leaders exploit it, directing the collective shadow outward, creating enemies to unify the group while distracting them from their own unconscious drives. In this light, trust becomes a dangerous currency. It is not that humans are inherently evil, but that they are rarely transparent to themselves. To trust blindly is to hand over power to forces even the person you trust may not fully understand. Jung's psychology teaches us that awareness, not paranoia, but sober recognition, is the only safeguard. By acknowledging the shadow in others, and more importantly within ourselves, we strip away the illusions that make betrayal inevitable. To understand Jung, then, is to see why blind trust is naive. It is to recognize that beneath every mask lies another layer, and beneath that, an unconscious terrain that shapes our lives more than we dare admit. And it is to realize that until a person has faced their own shadow, they cannot truly be trusted, not because they are wicked, but because they are strangers to themselves. Few experiences cut as deeply into the human psyche as betrayal. It is not just the breaking of trust, it is the shattering of an invisible foundation upon which we build our lives. To be betrayed is to see the mask of another person fall, revealing not the face we thought we knew, but the shadow that lurked beneath it. It is the sudden realization that the story we believed in was, at least in part, an illusion. Carl Jung understood betrayal not simply as a moral failing but as an existential event. For him, it represented disillusionment, a forced confrontation with the shadow of another. The pain lies not only in the act itself, but in what it reveals, that the noble words, the gestures of loyalty, the promises of permanence, were all fragile performances. Betrayal is the collapse of a narrative we trusted. Consider the realm of friendship. We confide in a friend, sharing our vulnerabilities, only to discover that trust used as a weapon, exposed, twisted, or abandoned at the moment we most needed support. Betrayal here does not just end a bond, it rewrites the past, forcing us to question whether any moment of loyalty was ever real. History is littered with political betrayals that altered the course of nations. Leaders once hailed as liberators revealed themselves as tyrants. Revolutions that promised equality delivered oppression. To the betrayed citizens, the pain was more than personal, it was collective, a devastating lesson in the fragility of trust on which civilizations rest. Religious history tells a similar story. Faithful followers place their trust in spiritual authorities, only to later uncover corruption, manipulation, and hypocrisy. The betrayal of the sacred strikes at the deepest levels of human meaning, eroding not only trust in institutions but in life itself. Even within families, the most intimate structures of human life, betrayal leaves scars that last for generations. A child who discovers that a parent is absent, abusive, or dishonest learns not just about personal pain, but about the terrifying unreliability of the world. In these early wounds, the psychology of betrayal is written into the core of the self, shaping how trust is given, or withheld, for the rest of life. Modern psychology confirms what Jung intuited: humans are wired to trust, but also to exploit trust. Trust is a survival mechanism. Without it, no relationship, no community, no society could function. Yet, this very mechanism makes us vulnerable. Studies show that people are more likely to believe others than to doubt them, even when warning signs appear. Evolution favored trust because it built cooperation, but at the same time, it created openings for deception. This duality is what makes betrayal inevitable. It is not a rare misfortune, but an inherent risk woven into the fabric of human interaction. Every act of trust carries with it the possibility of collapse. To live among others is to walk the edge between faith and disillusionment. Jung's insight was clear: betrayal reveals the hidden depths of human motives. It is a brutal unveiling, stripping away illusions and forcing us to see the shadow. The devastation is real, but so too is the awakening it brings. For in the ashes of betrayal lies a question that reshapes the way we move through the world. If trust is fragile, how should we live knowing that anyone, friend, leader, lover, or kin, carries within them both the mask and the shadow? History is not only a chronicle of wars and revolutions, but also of trust betrayed on a massive scale. Every collapsed empire, every toppled government, every disillusioned generation leaves behind the same cautionary echo: trust, once misplaced, becomes the silent weapon of manipulation. In the 20th century, entire nations surrendered their faith to charismatic leaders who promised salvation. In Germany, trust became the seed of catastrophe. Millions placed their hope in Adolf Hitler, a man who cloaked his darker ambitions beneath rhetoric of national pride and renewal. Citizens believed they were following a savior who would restore dignity and order. But in handing over their trust, they handed over their conscience. The result was devastation on a scale that scarred humanity forever. In Stalin's Soviet Union, trust was weaponized into fear. Citizens were told that loyalty to the state guaranteed safety, that trust in the party meant progress. Yet this trust became a trap. Neighbors betrayed neighbors, families whispered in fear, and millions disappeared into the machinery of terror. Here, trust was not freely given but enforced, a grim reminder that the most dangerous manipulation is when trust is fused with fear, making betrayal feel like survival. Religious history tells a parallel story. Institutions meant to be guardians of morality have often concealed corruption beneath the robes of holiness. For centuries, the faithful placed their trust in clergy who preached virtue while exploiting that very faith for power and wealth. When scandals erupted, the disillusionment was profound, not only shattering trust in institutions but destabilizing the very foundations of meaning for entire communities. To discover betrayal within the sacred is to realize that even the divine can be manipulated through human ambition. The financial world has also shown how trust, once exploited, leads to ruin. Consider the global financial crisis of 2008. Millions trusted banks, corporations, and regulators to protect their livelihoods. They placed faith in systems that promised growth and security. Yet beneath the polished facade, greed and deception thrived. When the illusion collapsed, ordinary people paid the price, losing homes, savings, and futures, while those who orchestrated the betrayal often walked away unscathed. Trust, once again, was revealed as the most fragile currency of all. Yet alongside these tragedies, history also remembers those who refused blind trust, who saw through illusions, and who became dangerous to the status quo. Dissidents who resisted totalitarian regimes, thinkers who exposed religious hypocrisy, whistleblowers who revealed corporate corruption, they all share one trait: they withdrew the trust that bound others to obedience. By refusing to be deceived, they became unpredictable, uncontrollable, and therefore threatening to those in power. Here, we glimpse the Machiavellian reality of power. Trust is rarely innocent. For the cunning, it is a resource to be cultivated, manipulated, and consumed. Leaders seek not only obedience but faith, for faith blinds people to contradictions. Corporations seek not only customers but believers, for belief silences doubt. Even relationships, when poisoned by control, twist trust into a leash rather than a bond. Machiavelli himself warned rulers that it is better to be feared than loved if one must choose. Yet he also knew the power of trust, how appearances of virtue and sincerity could secure loyalty while concealing ambition. Trust, in this sense, becomes a mask that power wears to hide its claws. The lesson of history is clear. Blind trust is never neutral. It is either the seed of flourishing or the beginning of exploitation. When given to the wrong hands, it builds prisons instead of communities, illusions instead of realities. Those who understand this truth begin to look at the world differently. They no longer see promises as guarantees, authority as virtue, or institutions as sacred. They become harder to manipulate, less predictable, more dangerous to systems that depend on blind faith. And yet, this awareness is not the death of trust. It is its transformation. For when one recognizes how trust has been misused, it no longer disappears, but sharpens. It becomes deliberate, cautious, and resilient. Trust is no longer surrendered blindly, but given with eyes open. History whispers its warning. Trust can bind civilizations together, but it can also enslave them. To learn from the past is to realize that the most dangerous people are not those who betray trust, but those who refuse to give it blindly. There comes a moment in life when the illusions collapse. You look around and realize the promises you believed in were not promises at all, but veils. The friend who swore loyalty disappears in the first storm. The leader who claimed to speak for the people reveals himself to be speaking only for power. The institutions that claimed to shelter you are exposed as fragile, corrupt, or self-serving. And in that silence, something begins to change. You begin to see the world with different eyes. When you stop trusting blindly, you do not become cold or bitter. Instead, you become clear. You learn that trust is not a default state but a currency that must be earned. The naive part of you dies, the part that assumed others would always have your best interests at heart. In its place, something sharper, something more resilient begins to emerge. You are no longer the person who believes the mask is the face. You have learned to look for the cracks, to listen for the silences between words, to pay attention to what power does rather than what it claims. Psychologists have long studied this transformation. Betrayal and disillusionment are often described as traumatic, but they are also catalytic. Jung called this process individuation, the integration of the self that comes from confronting both the light and the shadow, both the beauty of human connection and the darkness of human deception. The individual who has stopped trusting blindly is no longer fractured between fantasy and reality. They stand more whole, more grounded, more awake. But this transformation is unsettling to the world, because systems, whether political, religious, or economic, thrive on compliance. They rely on a steady reservoir of belief, faith, and unquestioning obedience. When someone withdraws their blind trust, they no longer fit into the machinery. They ask inconvenient questions. They resist manipulation. They can no longer be lured with empty promises or frightened by hollow threats. And so, they become dangerous. Not because they wield power, but because they are no longer controlled by it. History has shown us this type of person countless times. The whistleblower who refuses to believe the official story. The dissident who no longer accepts the slogans. The reformer who sees corruption behind the stained glass windows of the church. These individuals are rarely welcomed. More often, they are silenced, exiled, or destroyed. Because they embody a truth that terrifies authority, that human beings are capable of thinking for themselves. On a personal level, the transformation is equally profound. When you stop trusting blindly, relationships shift. You no longer confuse politeness with loyalty, charm with character, or power with integrity. You begin to measure people not by what they promise, but by what they consistently show. This clarity may cost you friendships, jobs, or even entire communities, but what remains is authentic. What remains is earned, not imposed. There is also a paradox here. To stop trusting blindly is not to live in permanent suspicion or isolation. It is to reclaim trust as something sacred, something you choose deliberately rather than give away carelessly. True trust becomes rarer, but infinitely more valuable. And when it is found, when another person proves themselves worthy, it is deeper, stronger, more enduring than the naive trust you once gave away freely. In many ways, this transformation is an initiation. It is the crossing of a threshold between childhood and adulthood, between illusion and clarity. The child trusts because they know no better. The adult who has suffered betrayal, who has seen masks fall, who has stared into the shadow, trusts only with wisdom. And this wisdom cannot be taken back. Once you see, you cannot unsee. This is why everything changes. Because when you stop trusting blindly, you step out of the current that carries most of humanity downstream. You are no longer moved by the tide of propaganda, no longer shaped by fear of exclusion, no longer seduced by false promises. You have reclaimed sovereignty over your mind. And in a world built on manipulation, nothing is more revolutionary than that. Every transformation carries a shadow. Just as the act of withdrawing blind trust can awaken clarity and independence, it can also slide into something darker. For some, the death of naivete does not lead to wisdom, but to despair. When trust collapses without integration, what follows is not freedom but isolation. There are countless stories of individuals who, after being betrayed or manipulated, retreat so deeply into mistrust that they can no longer connect with others. They begin to see deception in every word, malice in every gesture, hidden agendas in every act of kindness. What begins as vigilance hardens into paranoia. Instead of discernment, they cultivate suspicion. Instead of independence, they drift toward alienation. History offers vivid examples. Consider the dissidents who, after uncovering the lies of political regimes, withdrew not only from the state but from society itself. Some became prophets of doom, warning of endless conspiracies, unable to distinguish truth from fear. Others, in the religious sphere, abandoned their faith not to embrace clarity but to embrace bitterness, railing against humanity itself as irredeemably corrupt. In each case, the collapse of trust created not strength but fragmentation. Psychology explains this danger well. Studies show that human beings are wired for connection. Trust is not simply a social convenience but a biological necessity. When it is entirely withdrawn, the psyche begins to fracture. Chronic mistrust is linked to higher levels of anxiety, depression, and even physical illness. It is as though the refusal to risk trust shuts down the very mechanisms that make life meaningful. Without some form of connection, existence becomes a fortress, safe, perhaps, but unbearably empty. The irony is striking. In rejecting betrayal, some end up betraying themselves. They trade vulnerability for cynicism, openness for suspicion, intimacy for distance. And yet, in their fortress of mistrust, they feel no safer, only lonelier. The very act meant to protect them ends up suffocating them. We see this not only in individuals but in movements and cultures. Communities that define themselves primarily through mistrust, whether of governments, outsiders, or entire categories of people, often spiral into extremism. Fear becomes their language. Isolation becomes their identity. Their inability to integrate betrayal into a broader vision of humanity locks them in a cycle of hostility and defensiveness. This is why Jung's vision of maturity is so crucial. He did not advocate for blind faith, nor for total mistrust. Instead, he spoke of conscious trust, a trust rooted in awareness rather than illusion. It is the ability to look directly at the possibility of betrayal and still choose to engage, to risk, to connect. To withdraw trust completely is to amputate a vital part of the human experience. To trust blindly is to invite manipulation. But to trust consciously is to walk the razor's edge between vulnerability and strength. The danger of mistrust is not simply that it isolates us from others, it isolates us from ourselves. It reduces life to a perpetual state of defense, a war against shadows. But integration offers another path. The task is not to destroy trust, nor to surrender it blindly, but to refine it into something deliberate, resilient, and wise. This is the balance. The shadow of cynicism exists, but so does the light of conscious trust. One leads to isolation, the other to maturity. We have walked through the fragile terrain of trust, its beauty, its betrayal, its manipulation, and its collapse. But the journey does not end in despair. Jung reminds us that the path through darkness is not meant to imprison us in fear, but to awaken us to a higher form of freedom. The truly dangerous individual is not the one who rejects humanity outright, nor the cynic who retreats into suspicion. It is the one who sees clearly, the one who looks at history's illusions, society's manipulations, and the shadows in every human heart, and does not turn away. This kind of vision strips away innocence but replaces it with authenticity. Such a person cannot be easily controlled. Leaders cannot sway them with empty promises. Institutions cannot blind them with sacred masks. Lovers cannot deceive them with hollow words. They live in the awareness that every human carries both light and darkness, and they engage with the world not from naivete, but from understanding. This is why systems of power, whether political, religious, or cultural, often fear individuals who awaken in this way. A society thrives on compliance, a regime survives on obedience, a marketplace flourishes on blind faith in its symbols. But the one who has stopped trusting blindly, who has seen the machinery behind the curtain, becomes untouchable. They are no longer the prey of illusions. They stand outside the spell. Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming whole. It is not the path of comfort but of courage. To see one's own shadow, to accept one's flaws, to pierce through the masks of others without hatred, that is the work of maturity. And once it is done, a person is not only free, they are powerful in a way that no system can tolerate. The most dangerous freedom is not the power to dominate others, but the power to no longer be dominated. It is the strength of self-knowledge, the clarity of vision, the refusal to surrender one's soul to illusions. When you stop trusting blindly, you reclaim your power. And in a world built on manipulation, that makes you dangerous. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Once you do, no one can control you again.